Why play Quick Strikers? Well, you have a spot for a variable cost reroll where you're either playing around 2 cost or 3 cost reroll. You have an enabler or copies of the units will make it easier for you to hit the 3-star copies. You have melee items that can work for the frontline Quick Strikers or TF items to itemize towards the backline Quick Striker carry. However, it can be hard to hit without an enabler. A lot of times you're going for multiple 3-stars of different costs, so often if you don't have something that helps you to hit a lot of 3-star units, it might be a little bit awkward to stabilize and play around the board. It can also have very low without high rolling, because often if you're in a low roll spot, because you're dealing with melee units, they can often die too fast and you can find yourself in a very horrible predicament. Additionally, certain units are often very contested because, especially relying on Mbessa at one point for Quick Strikers, being an emissary unit could be hard to find. Additionally, TF and Loris often find their ways on many different boards, so they can be often difficult to 3-star and they're part of your max cap. Now, if you like my content, please make sure to like and subscribe. So this is my daily TFT content channel. I do guides and VOD reviews and stuff like that to try and help you understand and learn about the game. So if you like my content, if you've come here from watching like 1 or 2 of my videos and you decide to come back, please make sure to like and subscribe because it does help me out as a small content creator. Now, what are Quick Strikers? Let's go through the trait itself. So Quick Strikers, basically, they're like the dedicated frontline melee comp of the set. A lot of times there is some sort of melee style comp where you play around it. It basically has a 2, a 3, and a 4 Quick Strikers, and basically they move faster and they gain attack speed based on their target's missing health. So as your target, the target of the Quick Striker lowers their health, the Quick Strikers will start attacking faster. They have this ramp up effect to kind of finish off the job and kill the units quite quickly. Additionally, from 2 and 3 Quick Striker, you have this increase in attack speed that they have, but 4 Quick Striker has the bonus effects of on target death, they dash to the new target, and they also gain a shield for 3 seconds. Now, this last effect of dashing to the new target and gaining the shield is very substantial, and we'll talk about it a bit later, but whenever you're trying to play around Quick Strikers, if you're trying to play a dedicated Quick Striker board where you're re-rolling the low cost units, 4 Quick Striker is a massive power spike and is often required in order to stabilize the comp and get your guaranteed top 4. So when should you play Quick Strikers? Well, we said a little bit in the intro, but basically, if you have melee items where you can try and itemize either Nocturne or Akali or Mbessa, but typically you're going to itemize towards Akali, or if you have backline caster items that you can itemize TF with, these are good indicators that you can play around Quick Strikers. So you're quite flexible on your items because there's multiple different ways to play around it, but typically you'll be playing more towards AP, and we'll talk about that in a second, but there are different variations of playing Quick Strikers. Additionally, having an enabler is really good. Whenever I say an enabling augment, there's certain augments that buff certain units on your board or give you a lot of reroll potential. Something that works really well with Quick Strikers, for example, is Too Much Value, where you just collect a bunch of rerolls for playing a bunch of 2 costs, and because this comp is primarily 2 cost units, you end up playing a lot of 2 costs, so you can get a lot of free rerolls, and that helps you to hit all of your units. So much of this board's potential is hitting the 3-star versions of the units because you're playing a lot of low cost units on your board. So often you require some sort of gold, some sort of econ, or some sort of reroll related augment in order to help you hit everything. So now let's talk about our boards. Before we do that, we'll just talk about the trait and I'll introduce the carries. Now, it is later in the set, of course, so I'm sure everybody knows everything by now, but some people do start a little bit later, and maybe you haven't played much Quick Strikers. But basically, there are 4 Quick Striker units. Akali, which is a 2 cost, so she basically is an AP frontline unit that does a bunch of AP damage. You have a frontline Nocturne, which does AD damage. You have a backline Twisted Fate, which has this rotating cards that he can throw, and those cards basically do like different things, or not rotating, but he basically has like 3 different card effects that one of them does a stun, one of them restores health, and another one does damage. And then the last Quick Striker is Mbessa, who is also an emissary unit. Her emissary bonus gives armor to your whole team, but basically she is a 2 hex or like basically she can attack from like 2 hex range, and she dashes around and dashes through targets a lot. So she's kind of like the dedicated I'm gonna jump around type of unit. Now, when you're talking about Quick Strikers, there's 2 main boards that you usually play. You either play it towards Nocturne, which looks something like this, or you play it towards Akali, Twisted Fate, and Loris, which looks more like this. Now, we're just going to go over the Nocturne variation really fast, first of all, but we're not going to focus too much on it. We did talk a lot about Nocturne and Nocturne reroll when we were talking about Automata, and there is still an Automata video that's pretty much still relevant in terms of a lot of the details that it has. But I'm going to go over it briefly because it does also apply for Quick Strikers. But basically, when you're playing Nocturne, if you're trying to primary carry Nocturne, you're typically prioritizing AD items. So this is like, Nocturne, you usually want to put like, some sort of Omnivamp. So a lot of times you'll put him like, Hodge, IE, and then I personally like just having like double healing, like Hodge, IE, BT, but you can replace Hodge, IE with a damage item. Hodge, IE has good synergy because they're both glove items, so they work well together. However, his items can be really flexible because obviously when you're a melee frontline unit, you can build yourself more in a tanky way, you can build yourself more in a full DPS way, but especially if you have not ranged items on the Nocturne, you want to have some sort of Omnivamp on him. So usually I go for like a Hodge, Hodge Infinity Edge, and then I'll figure out the last item. One thing that's important though is that if you're playing around Nocturne, a lot of times you play 4 Automata, 4 Quick Striker. The Automata bonus is a lot of armor, and you get this bonus magic damage that you do from the Automata Blast. So a lot of times, as your last item, try not to build like super tanky items, specifically on Nocturne because of his Automata stat, basically. You don't want him to, or his Automata trait. You don't want to build something like a Titans, for example, because he gets the armor and MR from his trait, so it's actually pretty bad. It's an item that does significantly less, so you have a lot less value using this type of item. You're better off like building full damage or full Omnivamp to make sure that he pops off to his maximum potential. A lot of times when you're going for Nocturne 3-star, you also go for Akali 3-star because they're the same cost unit, and then you often want to have either a Mumu 3-star or Blitzcrank 3-star, one or the other. You prefer Blitzcrank, but you want one frontline 3-star unit to try and take the edge off of some of these frontline units, because a lot of times if Nocturne is trying to burst down different units, he might get bursted down himself because he'll get focus fired by everybody. A lot of times you can switch out your bottom units for a Malzahar, and you can cap out really high with 6 Automata if you have an Automata spat. So obviously if you hit 6 Automata, that's a huge power spike, which we talked about a lot in our Automata guide. But it's not super important either way, and then TF often holds your extra items, and sometimes you can even itemize towards Kog'Maw if you so choose. But he usually holds like utility, so like, if you make your anti-heal, and even if you make like a Last Whisper, sometimes you just put on the TF just because you triple itemize your backline unit to support the rest of everybody. But this isn't a variation that you normally should go for. A lot of times if you're trying to dedicate yourself towards Quick Striker, I wouldn't necessarily do it in an AD way. Yes, this AD line kind of works, and yes, if you have a bunch of Nocturnes or if you're playing around Automata, this is a valid option, but typically the Automata variation is something that you normally do just when you have Ornn artifacts. Nocturne with range is extremely powerful, so when you have Nocturne with range, a lot of times you just put the ranged artifact on him, you play around 4 Automata, and between the artifact blasts, the attack speed you get from Quick Striker, and the power of the Ornn artifacts, he basically just deletes everybody, and this is like those Exodia game-winning situations. So if you ever get a ranged item and you're playing around Quick Strikers, you can just play this variation with Nocturne, and then you can cap out later with like 5 costs or 6 costs. Now, the main way that people normally will play Quick Strikers, if you just want to play Quick Strikers, is this variation. So this variation is complete on level 8, but leading up to level 8, you're basically trying to play 4 Quick Striker, 4 Sentinel. Why are you playing this variation? This variation is typically known as the TF Loris reroll, but it's essentially TF Loris and Akali. These are the 3 units that matter on this board the most. So what you're usually trying to go for is Akali 3-star, Loris 3-star, and Twisted Fate 3-star. Now, when you're playing around this, all of these units are AP units, so Loris becomes your main tank for your board. If you can't hit the Loris 3, that's fine, because you usually can compensate by playing 4 Sentinel and pushing levels, but a lot of times you're going for at least Akali 3 and TF 3. Now, if you're in a spot where you want to roll on level 6, you could go for Nocturne 3, Akali 3 as a dual carry, but you're typically prioritizing items on the Akali, and eventually you're hoping to hit Twisted Fate 3 towards the end of your game. if that's the case. If not, you're rolling on level 7 odds, and you're going for Loris 3, Twisted Fate 3, and then as you roll for these units, you don't really pick up any copies of Nocturne besides like your basic ones. Like you just upgrade Nocturne once. You don't worry about buying items for Nocturne because he won't really do anything, and you're not really going to prioritize items on him, and instead you just pick up Akalis along the way, and you roll for all 3 of these on level 7. It's a little bit difficult sometimes because you have to decide if you're rolling on level 6 and stabilizing around Akali, or if you can greed and try and roll for Twisted Fate and Loris 3. The Twisted Fate variation, this is more expensive, obviously, right? It costs way more gold to make it to level 7 and to upgrade Twisted Fate to 3-star and Loris to 3-star. So you'll see a lot of people will often just go for Akali 3, Nocturne 3, and they'll end the game like this, which is a much lower cap variation of this board. I'm explaining, it's definitely a lower cap variation. I'll repeat it one more time because I always get comments about like, this version sucks, you shouldn't play it. This is a lower cap variation if you go for Nocturne 3, Akali 3. The only reason people do it is because if you're looking at your lobby and everybody's rolling 2 costs and you're gonna die, it's better to just upgrade these guys, itemize them, and play for your placements and just get your 4th and get out. Because if you try and greed too much for rolling on 7 for TF, you might hit nothing, not stabilize, and just lose the game. But we're going to talk about the better variation, which is playing around these units. So, when you're playing around the units, depending on who you hit first, you usually have to itemize towards AP. Akali has a lot of flexibility in her items, because as an AP frontline user, she can basically build towards more tanky AD, she's an AP frontline unit, so she can build towards melee items, she can build towards AP items, and she can also build towards different survivability items. So a lot of times, a common build that you'll see with Akali is Hodge JG. Why is that? Hodge JG, basically Hand of Justice, is an Omnivamp item that's using a glove, so it gives her some healing, allows her to have some survivability, as well as increases her damage. Jewel Gauntlet is another glove item that makes her abilities critically strike. So when you pair the 2 glove items, it gives her a really high critical strike chance, which allows her ult to more likely be a critical ult that does a significant chunk of damage. So these are a really good item pairing. You can always think of it like you have one glove on one hand and the other glove on the other hand. So typically you'll see something like this plus a damage item, and a lot of times it will be something like a guard breaker that just gives some level of damage amp, because now you have a lot of crit chance, you have a lot of AP, so you give yourself damage amp, which then scales your damage as much as you can. Sometimes you'll see a Rabadon's, which gives a bunch of AP and damage amp. Rabadon's a little bit high roll because obviously you're using a lot of rods in an AP comp, so you can't necessarily just like slam a Rabadon's and say that's it, GG. It's often difficult to justify it. Or you'll see something like a Giant Slayer even. Giant Slayer isn't necessarily the best, but in certain lobbies, especially if there's other rerollers, it's pretty good. And it also gives damage amp and good stats for what Akali needs, like AP and attack speed and damage amp, right? But you'll also see many other builds. Sometimes if you need your Akali to be a little bit more tanky, you'll go for like something like double healing with the Hodge JG. Sometimes you don't even make a Jewel Gauntlet. Sometimes you just go for pure damage amp, and you can go for like double healing and a Titans. Just make a more frontline tank type of build. You can also go for Crown Guard. Crown Guard is really good on Akali, just gives her survivability as well as AP, right? It works almost like a shield that you would get from a Bloodthirster. You just get a health shield, like a second lease at life. Often Edge of Night is a little bit wasted because Edge of Night mostly just gives attack speed. It does give survivability, but often it's a little bit more awkward, so I wouldn't necessarily play Edge of Night on her unless you have like the Edge of Night augment. But even like a QSS sometimes is really good. Just let her attack as much as possible and not get stunned at all. But the world is your oyster, because as a frontline melee user, there's lots of items that you can make that are just AP items, typically for backline units, that work really well on her. And additionally, you have a lot of survivability options that work really well. But like I said, a common build that you'll see is Hodge JG. It's not necessarily the only one you have to do. You can build like full melee, like I was saying. You can go like, you know, not Sterix, but like you can go like BT Titans for like a more tanky build plus a damage item. You can go Rabadons, etc. But I just want to let you guys know that there is a lot of flexibility. But for now, let's just put these ones. So that's like one of the, but the reason I'm talking about the flexibility so much, you might be like, okay, we get it. She's flexible items. What it does is it allows you to stabilize really early. That's why a lot of people play around Akali and stabilize really well around Akali. She's very flexible with her items. She's very strong. If you have never played on Akali 3, she often can win pretty easily. You have good synergies that can easily fit into your board, which we'll talk about in a second. And If there's any items that you maybe want to switch or switch around later, you can often put them on the TF later anyways. So building her towards pure damage or pure tankiness, these things can always be swapped around with the other units on your board. So just as a mental note, always remember, like, you know, you can prioritize just making damage and have Akali be your mid game and or late game carry, and then worry about everything else after. She actually pops off with almost everything. I think my favorite build was Gunblade, Rabadons. I had a game where I got dropped like 3 rods off of one of the encounters, and I made Gunblade Rabadons. I think that was the strongest Akali I've had in my games, but you know, you can try out your own. Now, Twisted Fate is a caster. A lot of times I think you would want to have a Shojin. Now, you don't necessarily need a Shojin because the Quick Striker trait gives you so much attack speed, so often he doesn't have problems casting. However, Shojin helps out a lot, so I would always make a Shojin if I can, in order to deal with the like having more consistent output of damage. Also, a lot of times, Twisted Fate, because he scales really well and he hits backline units, it works really nicely with Archangels. So I really like to make like Shojin Archangels if I can, but often because Twisted Fate hits multiple units and you can often snipe backline units, he's also really good with just utility items. And this is where things come into play a lot of the time. A lot of times you'll stabilize around something that looks like this in your mid game. You'll go for like Akali 3 on level 6 and a TF2, and this is why a lot of people play around Akali. Akali's super flexible on items. TF hits many units and backline units, so therefore he can hold different utility items really well, like Shiv and Morello, and just apply them pretty evenly to the board. And this is a really great way to play for placements, and that's why Quick Striker has become really, really relevant, in addition to being really strong and having a really high max cap around this Twisted Fate. But if you're going for Twisted Fate carry, you can go for pure damage. A lot of times, like, you can even go for full crit, right? Jewel Gauntlet Guard Breaker in this case. You can also go for Jewel Gauntlet Archangels. You have much flexibility with him as well. And a lot of them have good performance in different games. A lot of it's situational. So you have to kind of decide if I'm itemized. Just like, know that if you're playing Twisted Fate 3-star, you don't really want to put utility items on him at that point, because if he's your main carry, you want to have as much damage as possible. Loris, you can just build as many items as possible that are tank items, so he can often hold utility tank items or additional items, right? So like Spark, Sunfire could work out well on him. Typically, because he's a Sentinel, you want to scale him better with things that provide him with durability or HP, because he already gets a bunch of armor from Sentinel. Now, when you're playing this board, you always need to play 4 Quick Strikers. We haven't talked about Abessa Nocturne that much. Abessa can hold your AD items late game, and Nocturne can also hold your AD items, but you shouldn't prioritize towards AD items. A lot of times if you're playing this board, you're trying to itemize and play towards this Akali and this TF as early as possible. So you're trying to play more towards like AP items, AP frontline items or AP backline items. And you have pretty good flexibility with those items, so you can often make like many different things, and you can try and kill your components in the best way possible. If you don't have rods and tiers, for example, trying to make components that still work with these 2 units is probably your best bet. When you're leveling, you always want to have 4 Quick Striker in, so you can never drop these units. 4 Quick Striker is a massive increase in power level. Now, it might not seem like it, because like if you're playing around Twisted Fate 3, some of the effects don't seem that important, like the Quick Strikers dashing to the target and gaining the shield. However, it allows your front line to have a lot more survivability. So even if Twisted Fate is your main carry, you always want to have 4 Quick Striker in, because not only do you get the boosted attack speed, which is substantial and is important, the dashing and the shielding that applies to your other units gives your board a lot of survivability. Additionally, you have the shield, which then can scale really well because you're playing around Sentinels, so your whole team gets armor. So you always want to play 4 Sentinel. 4 Sentinel synergizes really well, because if you're playing around Akali, you can fit in 3 Rebel as well because of the inter-team synergy of Rebel and Sentinel. So playing these 2 units allows you to easily fit in 3 Rebel. And with 3 Rebel, your Akali gets more HP as well as some boosted stats from the 3 Rebel proc after losing some HP. So this board is very concise, it's very tight, it fits really nicely together. One of the big issues though is that it also fits on level 8, or you need to be level 8, because 4 Sentinel is a pretty large spike, but 4 Quick Striker is pretty much essential if you're playing around these units. If you play 3 Quick Striker, you will noticeably lose rounds often, and you will feel the pinch. So it is often very difficult. Because of this 4 Sentinel, 4 Quick Striker build, often you'll see that sometimes people will also even take a Quick Striker emblem and they'll put it on somebody else and then eventually move it to they'll put on a unit to carry and then they'll drop the Nocturne. Because the Nocturne's the most useless one. You're not going to 3-star him, you're not going to itemize him in this build, and allows you to stabilize a little bit earlier because you can fit in 4 Quick Striker, 4 Sentinel on level 7. So sometimes people will even take a Quick Striker emblem and then you'll transfer this Quick Striker emblem onto like a 6 cost or a 5 cost later once you make it to level 8. I wouldn't always recommend taking a Quick Striker emblem and forcing towards this. It does help you to stabilize, but it's like, you know, it hurts your max cap a lot of the time because it's like, so usually you're taking this through augment and other augments will give you a little bit more combat power typically. But like I said, if you're unable to level and you're stuck with low econ, then that's something that can help you as well. Just to let you know that it is more takeable now. Namely because the Akali and the Twisted Fate became the main carries. In the past, you usually rolled for Akali Nocturne, and then the Quick Striker emblem was less useful, but I digress. Often you only really play around Mbessa late game. This is not a comp where you want to tempo and play around Mbessa as your main carry, if that makes sense. You always want to be rerolling Akali, Twisted Fate. Ideally all 3 of these get 3-starred, and that's your best way of capping in a consistent way. But if you can't 3-star all of them, whichever one you 3-star, you can play deeper into those traits or kind of structure your items and game plan around them, right? So like if your Akali is 3-starred, you can put your utility on TF, and if your TF is 3-starred, then you can build more tank items to support the TF instead of building more damage. But either or is fine. So that's basically Quick Strikers. I'm trying to think if there's anything else that I missed in general. Oh yeah, Sentinel. So Sentinel is quite important, but you could drop it at certain points. But typically you want it for Sentinel, and then on level 9, you will just play your 5 cost and your 6 cost in order to cap out the board a little bit higher. There's also many other variations that you can high roll around this, especially with Enforcer. If you have an Enforcer emblem, you can often play this type of board with 4 Enforcer, and then you just level for like a random Caitlyn or some shit. This does happen quite a bit. I've seen it happen a couple times, and it does cap pretty high. But these are more for like those wacky encounters where you get lots of emblems, right? So whenever I'm showing you these emblem variations, this is more for like if you're playing in like a loot sub, for example, and you're trying to find another way to cap out. Because the Twisted Fate, basically the gold that you invest in this Twisted Fate is massive. So he's always going to be your best carry. Obviously, everybody's dream if you're playing around Quick Strikers is to play Twisted Fate 3-star, not to play the other ones 3-star. He's going to be your main carry because of how much gold he's invested. He is just a broken, really strong unit if you 3-star him. Even at 2-star, a lot of times you're very stable. So, of course, you can play towards these. You want to play towards it, but you can't necessarily always play towards it, which is why some of these other variations come into play a lot of the time. Additionally, this comp does work really well in those RNG encounters. I talked about loot sub for a second. But this board, something that's really annoying, at least to me, is how easily it can spike very hard. So if you look at all of these different units, both the automata version and the TF Sentinel version that I'm showing here, they can spike really hard off of artifacts, as well as emblems, as well as like or an artifact, as well as support items. There's many different ways to spike the board. Basically, Akali is really good with a lot of these Ornn artifacts that allow for survivability. Loris makes a shield, so he's really good with a lot of the tank items, both the ones that scale up HP a lot, but also there's the other artifacts. I'm trying to find it. Unending Despair I'm looking for. Right, Unending Despair is also really broken on him, especially if you have him 3-starred. Twisted Fate has a stun, and he hits multiple backline units, so things like snipers aren't that bad on him. Wits Ends are also okay with the attack speed and just doing a bunch of damage. But additionally, even something like Horizon Focus, where it only works if a unit stuns another unit and it deletes HP. This also works really well on TF. So it's really easy to hit items that fit this board really well. And then additionally, any of the ranged items could go on Nocturne, and then you could just pivot into playing Nocturne carry. Even if you don't have the 4 automata variation, unless you hit it, like, if you hit it earlier, you can always pivot into this, because all you have to do is swap out the Sentinels for automata. But you also have the win condition of this with Nocturne. So if you're ever playing an encounter where you can hit Ornn artifacts, or if you're playing this comp and you have the option of an Ornn artifact, a lot of times it's very hard to miss, and almost all of them can fit on somebody on the board. It's very unlikely that you're going to pop open your artifact and see nothing that's usable. Almost all of them will be usable, which is a little bit annoying sometimes because like somebody will just be playing quick strikers and then all of a sudden it's like, oh, they hit Ornn artifact, I guess they just win the game. But you know, it is what it is. That's just something to note about this. So like certain encounters, right? So if we think about the encounters, things like Savika could work really well with this comp, as well as wind up, well, not wind up monkey, I'm trying to look for it, where is it, Jace as well. But a lot of times like Savika, it's a good way to like reroll while also mitigating your chance of low roll, because you have win conditions that can occur based on the drops that you would get. So now let's talk about our early game boards. So early game, I was talking about it quite a bit, but basically you always want to try and stack 4 quick striker as soon as possible. So a lot of times if you're just playing around these units, you'll have a board that looks something like this. You usually won't have Mbessa, and you'll usually be rolling on level 6. A lot of times on level 6, what's best is just to play a bunch of Sentinels, and to additionally fit in, where is the, Aurelia. So a lot of times your board will look something like this, and then like, you know, if you're playing around Akali to stabilize your mid game, you'll just play 3 Rebel, a lot of times in the form of a set. So you'll just play like some sort of, let me just play this, sorry, it's a little bit confusing, there we go. So like your board will often look like this on level 6, just like playing 3 quick striker, Rebel, and then 2 Sentinel. If you don't have all of the units that you need, like if you don't have a Twisted Fate, you can swap this out for a Tristana, you can swap it out for pretty much anybody. But a lot of times, the Rebel helps your Akali to stabilize, and you're stabilized around Akali too. That's why I was talking about like flexible items and Akali 2, because a lot of times you're playing Akali 2 for most of your mid game, and then you're kind of deciding based on how many Akalis you hit. Should I roll on level 6 to get Akali 3 to stabilize, or am I going level 7 to play around Twisted Fate? Something else we talked about was too much value very early on in the slides. This board fits really nicely with too much value because, as you can see, we're already playing 4 2 costs. A lot of times you can also choose to not play these 2 units and play a full board of 2 costs in order to accumulate a lot of rerolls. And by accumulating all those rerolls, so for example, I'll show you what I mean. You can play something like this, right, in your mid game, where you get Sentinel in, you just lose Rebel, and you put Tristana in for Emissary, and you get a lot of free rerolls on your stage 2, and then that sets you up to have a lot of econ in order to hit all of your 3 stars later in the game, because eventually you're going to transition to playing a board that looks more like this. As soon as you have an Mbessa, as soon as you have an Mbessa, if you're level 7 or level 8, you basically want to swap out whatever unit to play Mbessa, because the 4 quick striker buff is going to be way more substantial than the Sentinel or even Rebel. So a lot of times you will drop one of the units, often Rel is going to be not played, and your board's going to look like this, because as soon as you can play your 4 quick striker, then you're super stable around your 4 quick striker. Like I said, if you really have to, you can also go for Nocturne 3. Often if you have a lot of gold, like if you have something like Prismatic Ticket or Starry Night, I don't necessarily recommend this comp with Starry Night, because Twisted Fate is something that you're going to go for, so a lot of times you're taking Starry Night just to hit Nocturne and Akali, which isn't the greatest value for the augment that you're taking. But either way, if you're in a spot where you can hit Nocturne 3 for free, go ahead. I'm not saying not to hit it for free. What I'm trying to say is, like, based on how much gold you have, a lot of times it's more worthwhile just to push levels, make sure that you hit your max cap, just not itemize the Nocturne, itemize towards Twisted Fate 3, Loris 3, Akali 3, and then level and get your fourth Sentinel back in, so that you can just cap out like this. Board complete on level 8, and then level 9 you can cap out your board a little bit higher. So what are your conditions for success? We kind of alluded to them a lot. Now, in this video, I've been talking a lot about flexibility. So you do want to be relatively uncontested, obviously, because you're playing a reroll comp. AP items are really good, as well as artifacts. They can often work really well with this comp. But AP items works particularly well because if you're going for a max cap variation of this comp, a lot of times it's better just to itemize completely towards Akali and Twisted Fate, and then just build like your shred so that you have magic resist reduction and you're good to go. But your early games has to usually have units, or you have to have a really good reroll spot. You're never really playing quick strikers to play around Mbessa carry without 3-starring some of the other units along the way. But something that's really important with this comp is that you really need good econ. Not only do you have to hit all of the units, you also have to eventually find an Mbessa, which Mbessa could be hard to find sometimes because she is an emissary unit, so often people just hold on to Mbessas just to play her for the emissary bonus. And additionally, you have to play a comp where you're rerolling for many units. If you're playing around Twisted Fate and Loris, it's very expensive because they are 3-star units, so each of these takes like 30 gold in of themselves, right? So if you have to have 30 gold just for these guys, plus the gold to level up, plus the gold for Akali if you're going for Akali, plus the gold to upgrade everybody else, it becomes very expensive very fast. So often, if you don't have a good econ, it's hard to hit your max cap, and it can often be a bit of a struggle to get a top 4. However, I do believe Akali is broken, and if you can stabilize around Akali 3, often you're pretty much guaranteed your top 4. You might be outscaled by some of the other reroll comps that exist, but a lot of times if you hit Akali 3 on level 6 and then you push levels after that, you're often quite stable and you're good to go. But as you can see, I've kind of given you these things. They don't sound as drastic. I'm not making as big a deal about them. I'm just trying to explain the facets where things can go wrong. It's usually a very consistent comp when you play around Quick Strikers. It's part of the reason why people like it. It has a lot of flexibility with the items. It's a lot of flexibility with the units that you play. You can't really low roll super hard, because even if you giga low roll and you get a bunch of AD items and you're already committed Quick Strikers, you can often just like itemize Mbessa, itemize Nocturne. You still have units that you can put the items on and make things work with. But it's often hard to cap without the 3 stars, namely having an additional 3-star besides the Akali. Usually it's Akali 3, and then you have to have Loris or TF or both in order to have like a really good chance of going first. But often you can get a top 4 which is one of them 3-starred, which is why it's super consistent, and a lot of times it's pretty easy to play. But that's it. Thank you for watching. Hopefully that was enjoyable. Make sure to like and subscribe if you like the content. Like I said before, I did talk more in depth about Nocturne with the automata guide. It was a much older guide, so I'm not sure how relevant it still is, but I'm pretty sure it's still relevant in terms of talk about the artifacts and stuff. But we did talk about it a lot in most recent videos. Like a lot of the recent videos, whenever I'm talking about reroll comps, I think like in every patch note review that I've done, in the past 3 of them, I've talked about Quick Strikers. So this is kind of like a accumulation of some of that and a little bit more of a digestible package of these how to play guides. Thank you for watching. And yeah, thank you. See ya. Bye-bye.